School didn't really make sense to me. Sport was the first thing that really made sense to me, and my brain, my head, my body. And I always had a bit of a gift for doing lots of different sports. So when I was a kid, I played football. I got scouted for Nottingham Rugby Club, Nottingham Athletic Club. So I was really good at sports straight away, and using my body and being outside and moving around, it just made sense. Now, I got spotted and scouted for my first gymnastics club trial when I was 7 years old, and I guess the talent is what got me through that door. And I wasn't very good. I wasn't very flexible back then. I wasn't necessarily very good at the gymnastic skills. I just started it. But what I was very strong. I had a natural ability for being very strong and powerful, and they gave me a chance, and that's what got me ultimately into gymnastics. And it's funny, when I started gymnastics, I didn't really think I was talented when I was a kid. And growing up, I had built this narrative in my head that I was a kid that had to work hard. I wasn't quite as good as the other kids in my group. And I think that was because I started gymnastics quite late. Although 7 is really young, for a sport like gymnastics, most kids are doing like mums and tots at the age of 3, 4, 5 years old. And the kids in my group, and my teammates at the time, Rhys, Andy, they'd already been training since they were literally 4 or 5 years old, so they were just quite far ahead of me. And I always thought that was just, I compared myself to them and just thought that, I'm not as talented as these guys, so I'm going to have to work much harder if I want to be as good as them. And it's interesting, and that narrative stayed with me throughout the whole of my gymnastics career. And looking back now, it wasn't until I met up with Rhys and we went for a pint and a game of pool, and he told me, like, do you know how talented you were when you were a kid? And I kind of looked at him and I said, what? I was like, what are you talking about? Because Rhys, for me, was the most talented kid I'd ever come across in gymnastics. Throughout my 21-year career, he was just incredible. He was a performer. He could do nothing in the week. He wouldn't do anything in training. He'd kind of just mess around, half-heartedly try things, and then on a competition, he'd just switch it on, and he'd win. So for me, that coming from him, I couldn't believe it. But looking back, I guess, at 8 years old, I had my first trial for the GB team. And I'd only started gymnastics at 7. So a year into starting gymnastics, I had a trial for the Great Britain gymnastics team. So I must have been incredibly talented, but I just didn't know it at the time. And like I said, I was really strong, really powerful. So I certainly improved very quickly on the floor, the vault, and the rings. And on the rings, I remember one day we'd gone in, I think it was a Saturday, and Sergey was telling us about this skill called a crucifix. And there was nobody in our gym that could do a crucifix. And so we were all getting on the rings and trying it. And I was just kind of watching, because I was quite shy back then when I was younger. I used to be very quiet in the gym. I'd have a big personality at home, but in the gym I was quite quiet because there was a lot of big personalities in my group. And I can remember all the guys getting on and trying this crucifix and lowering down. And I thought, I'm going to have a go. And I kind of took myself off to one side, to the set of rings where nobody was really watching. I got up on these rings and I just went down and held a crucifix at 9 years old for like 3 seconds. And everyone in my group couldn't believe it. And Sergey straight away said, right, Sam, that's in your routine. So I was performing a crucifix on the rings, which is probably the most iconic skill in gymnastics, at 9 years old. So I must have been incredibly talented. And I think, a lot of that probably came from my family, and it came from my family background. All my family were sportsmen. So my granddad was a footballer, my dad was a footballer, I played football, my brother's a footballer. My granddad's brother was a speed skater, had trials for the Olympic Games. I think my grandma's dad was a really good snooker player. My mum did gymnastics when she was a kid. And my body type certainly lent itself to gymnastics. I was small, powerful, loved hard work, but definitely had a natural ability for moving my body and knowing where my body was in space and time. So one of my key skills in gymnastics, that was definitely one of my real super strengths, was my spatial awareness. I was a bit like a cat. I did get injured a lot, but that's because I took a lot of risks. But I could also, if I got lost in the air, I would always find my feet. And I guess one of the athletes that I really look to when it comes to talent, and I think about talent, one of the athletes that I trained with, and one of the great champions that we ever produced in Great Britain in gymnastics, was Lewis Smith.